When Jesus stepped into the waters of the Jordan River at age 30, his hands were already deeply scarred and calloused from 18 unrecorded years of crushing physical reality. The Gospels give us the magnificent opening act of a divine ministry, but they deliberately skip the brutal, quiet preparation of the man who had to live it first. Between the 12-year-old boy debating the scholars in the Jerusalem temple and the 30-year-old prophet commanding the Sea of Galilee, there lies a vast, silent ocean of time, 18 years. That is more than half of his entire life on earth, unfolding in complete historical obscurity, hidden away in a small, dusty village tucked into the northern hills. For centuries, readers of the Bible have treated those 18 silent years as a pause button on sacred history, as though Jesus were simply waiting in a divine holding room until the clock struck 30. But history, context, and archaeology demand that we reconsider. The silence of the biblical record is not an absence of life. It is a curtain drawn over an intense, formative crucible. Before he ever spoke a single beatitude, healed a single broken body, or confronted the rulers of his day, Jesus was a real human being navigating the harsh economic and physical realities of first-century Roman Judea. To understand what shaped him, we have to look past the stained glass windows of later tradition and stand in the dirt of first-century Nazareth. Picture the village at dawn. The morning air is crisp, thick with the smell of wet earth, olive wood smoke, and livestock. Nazareth was small, home to perhaps 200 to 300 people living in simple stone dwellings built into the limestone hillsides. There were no marble columns here, no paved plazas, and no wealthy patrons. It was an isolated community of peasant farmers, stonecutters, and woodworkers living under the shadow of heavy taxation and relentless physical toil. It was within this modest setting that the foundational architecture of his earthly life was forged. A man does not step out at age 30, possessing the profound emotional endurance, the razor-sharp intellectual clarity, and the unshakable spiritual authority required to upend an empire without a long, quiet gestation. In human terms, authority is not conjured out of thin air. It is tempered through daily obedience to immediate realities. It is carved out through the repetition of physical work, tested by the sting of personal grief, fed by hours of quiet reflection, and sealed in solitary prayer. When we examine the archaeological landscape of Lower Galilee during the reign of Herod Antipas, we begin to see that these 18 unrecorded years were far from passive. They were years of rigorous, practical preparation. Jesus did not bypass the human condition to deliver his message. He inhabited it fully. He knew the feeling of chalky limestone dust clinging to sweat-soaked skin, the sting of blistered palms, the anxiety of oppressive imperial levies, and the quiet weight of domestic responsibility when bread was hard to come by. Every sermon he would later preach, every parable he would tell about debt, laborers, seed, stone, and family obligations was rooted in what he experienced during these silent decades. His message did not come from a distant theological academy in Jerusalem. It came from the dirt, the workshop, the home, and the solitary hills of his youth. What then were the specific milestones of this hidden season? What did Jesus actually do during those long, unwritten years to prepare himself for the 3 years that would alter human destiny forever? When we synthesize the subtle clues left in the text with historical scholarship, 4 distinct, grounded disciplines emerge from the silence. Long before he ever spoke to listening crowds, Jesus learned the discipline of heavy physical labor. In the Gospel of Mark, when he returns to teach in his hometown, the astonished neighbors ask a question that cuts through centuries of theological myth. Is not this the Tekton? While modern English translations often render this Greek word simply as carpenter, the physical reality of first-century Galilee was far harsher. In an arid hill country where large timber was scarce and reserved for the wealthy, a tekton was primarily a stonecutter, a mason, and a rough construction builder, someone who shaped whatever raw materials the rugged land provided. Just 4 miles northwest of Nazareth, an hour's brisk walk across the rocky ridges, lay the sprawling city of Sepphoris. During Jesus' teenage years and throughout his 20s, Herod Antipas was transforming Sepphoris into the capital ornament of Galilee, turning the city into a massive, multi-decade construction project. Historians and archaeologists widely recognize that this immense building boom drew skilled stone artisans from all the surrounding hamlets. It is entirely plausible that Jesus, making that 4-mile trek across the hills at sunrise, spent years hauling dense limestone blocks, swinging heavy iron mallets, and fitting structural lintels under a punishing Mediterranean sun. This was not symbolic or light work. It was bone-wearying, skin-blistering reality. Thick limestone dust from the quarries would have settled deep into his lungs, and the abrasive friction of rough rock would have permanently thickened the skin of his hands. He learned to read the grain of wood, the fractures within hard stone, and the structural balance required to keep a stone arch from collapsing. When Jesus spoke in his parables about digging deep and laying foundations upon solid rock instead of shifting sand, or about the cornerstone that the builders rejected, he was not speaking in abstract metaphors. He was speaking the concrete language of an artisan who had spent decades wrestling with stone, muscle, and gravity. Beyond the physical grind of the building sites, Jesus was forced to shoulder the crushing weight of domestic leadership. In the biblical narrative, Joseph is actively present when Jesus is 12 years old in the Temple of Jerusalem. But after that single moment, the patriarch vanishes completely from the historical record. By the time Jesus begins his public ministry at 30, Joseph is nowhere to be seen, while Mary is frequently mentioned. In ancient antiquity, where life expectancy was short and labor-induced injuries or diseases were commonplace, this silence points to a quiet personal tragedy. Joseph died during Jesus' youth, leaving his eldest son to bury him in the rocky soil of Nazareth. In first-century Jewish culture, the death of a father was not merely an emotional heartbreak. It was an immediate economic emergency. As the firstborn son, the heavy legal and moral responsibility of holding the household together fell squarely upon Jesus. He became the primary provider and protector for his widowed mother, Mary, and his younger siblings, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, and his sisters. He had to secure daily bread in a subsistence peasant economy where missing even a single week of labor meant genuine hunger for his family. This domestic burden was severely compounded by a brutal dual tax system. The working people of Galilee lived under the crushing weight of Roman imperial tributes, local tolls, and religious temple tithes, which together often stripped away 30 to 50% of a working household's meager earnings. Jesus knew firsthand what it was to negotiate contracts with local landowners, to feel the quiet panic of an empty olive oil jar, and to lie awake at night calculating how to pay imperial taxes without losing the family home. His later teachings about desperate widows searching for lost coins, relentless debt collectors demanding the last penny, and older sons laboring under family obligations were born directly out of the domestic survival he fought for every single day. While his daylight hours were consumed by physical labor and family survival, Jesus quietly engaged in an extraordinary intellectual and textual discipline. When he eventually launched his public ministry, the educated religious elite in Jerusalem were openly bewildered, asking how an ordinary laborer from the rural north possessed such vast learning without ever attending their formal rabbinic academy. His mastery of the ancient texts was unmistakable, but it was forged entirely outside the prestigious schools of Hillel or Shammai. In a small mountain village like Nazareth, formal schools did not exist. Yet the local synagogue housed precious, hand-copied parchment scrolls of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. In the evenings, after the building tools were cleaned and the household was asleep, Jesus would have studied by the flickering, smoky flame of an oil lamp, fueled by the bitter dregs of pressed olives. In the quiet darkness of a modest stone house, he meditated deeply on the ancient Hebrew text, translating its profound poetry into the spoken Galilean Aramaic of daily village life. This was never passive memorization. It was an intense, decades-long internal synthesis. He wrestled with the complex, sweeping imagery of Isaiah, the rigorous legal demands of Deuteronomy, and the raw human laments of the Psalms. He spent years understanding the true heartbeat of the law, stripping away the accumulated legalism of his contemporaries to uncover the core principles of divine mercy, justice, and humility. In those long, solitary nights of reading, reflection, and quiet absorption, he developed the razor-sharp theological depth that would later dismantle the most sophisticated arguments of the Jerusalem establishment. Alongside physical labor, domestic responsibility, and intellectual study, Jesus cultivated a deliberate rhythm of solitary retreat into the wilderness. Throughout the Gospels, we repeatedly read that he slipped away to desolate places to pray long before dawn. This was not a novel habit he adopted after being baptized in the Jordan. It was an ingrained spiritual discipline carved into his character during 18 silent years among the Galilean hills. Rising directly behind the village of Nazareth, the limestone ridges provided a stark, windswept sanctuary. Looking south across the vast Jezreel Valley, the historic stage of ancient prophets, judges, and kings, Jesus had a quiet vantage point far removed from village, gossip, family demands, and commercial noise. In the profound silence of the northern wilderness, under a cold canopy of desert stars, he spent entire nights in unbroken communion with the Father, whom he addressed with the intimate, tender Aramaic word Abba. These solitary hours were where his human will was tested, surrendered, and aligned with his ultimate destiny. Out in the cold night air, away from human applause and human scrutiny, he faced the looming gravity of his calling. He understood the rising political tensions between Rome and Judea, the deep corruption within the temple hierarchy, and the brutal cost of the prophetic path that lay before him. Before he ever faced the questioning crowds, the hostile Sanhedrin, or the judgment seat of Pontius Pilate, he had already fought and won the battle for his own soul in the desolate silence of the hills. We must remain academically honest about the limits of the historical record. There are no surviving personal diaries detailing Jesus' thoughts at age 20. No signed construction invoices bearing his name from the excavations of Sepphoris, and no Roman census records listing the humble artisan workshop of Joseph and his sons. In the centuries following his death, various non-canonical apocryphal texts attempted to fill this silence with sensational folklore, inventing stories of a magical boy who formed birds from clay or struck down childhood rivals. Yet the four canonical Gospels preserve an absolute, profound restraint. They offer 18 years of unbroken silence, a quietness that reveals far more about his genuine humanity than any sensational myth ever could. What archaeology and historical geography provide instead is the concrete physical and social reality of the world he inhabited. Excavations at Nazareth reveal rock-cut storage cisterns, modest hillside foundations, and agricultural terraces that paint an unmistakable picture of rural, peasant life. Excavations at nearby Sepphoris uncover the contrasting grandeur of paved colonnades, grand Roman villas, and civic amphitheaters, built by the sweat of local Jewish artisans who walked back to their simple villages under the shadow of imperial control. This archaeological record grounds Jesus firmly in the real dirt, economic friction, and cultural crosscurrents of his time. The silence of the biblical text was never an empty void. It was the quiet unfolding of an authentic human life. When we examine the 3 brief years of his public ministry, we are looking at the visible summit of a mountain whose vast foundation was built in the quiet obscurity of Nazareth. Every virtue he displayed under public scrutiny was practiced first in private. A leader does not demonstrate boundless patience to demanding crowds without having spent years learning patience over stubborn stone, rough timber, and difficult neighbors. A teacher does not speak with piercing empathy to destitute widows and struggling day laborers unless he has sat at his own table, watching his widowed mother count the remaining grain while tax collectors stood outside the gate. When Jesus finally descended the rocky hill country toward the Jordan River to stand before John the Baptist, he carried the full weight of those 18 years into the water. When he stepped into the cool, swirling current at age 30, his body bore the physical truth of his early life. The hands that were about to heal the sick, break bread for the hungry, and touch the outcast were thick with calluses and marked by the bite of iron chisels. The shoulders that would soon carry the burdens of a broken world had already carried the weight of limestone blocks and the domestic survival of his family. The 4 quiet disciplines of his youth, the brutal craft of the builder, the heavy responsibility of the firstborn son, the solitary nights of scripture study, and the fierce communion of the wilderness, were never an interruption to his divine calling. They were the very forge in which his human endurance was completed. When Jesus was eventually forced to take up the rough wood of a Roman cross, it was not the first time his hands had held heavy timber, nor was the darkness of that final hill the first wilderness he had ever conquered. The 18 silent years of Jesus were never missing. They were the quiet, essential foundation that made everything else possible.